Some people survived wars, plagues, and empires, and still died because of a scarf, a chair, a door, food, animals, or one stupid decision. This video is 44 real deaths from history that sound fake, and none of them were murders. No killers, just bad luck, ego, timing, and reality being ruthless. 1. You can run from your problems, but you cannot hide from a tactical tortoise airstrike. The ancient Greek writer Aeschylus was paranoid because a prophecy said a falling object would kill him, so he spent all day in empty fields avoiding roofs. But he forgot to cover his head. An eagle flying overhead was carrying a tortoise and mistook the playwright's shiny bald head for a perfect white stone to crack the shell on. The bird dropped its lunch with sniper precision, smashing Aeschylus instantly. He spent his whole life avoiding falling buildings only to be taken out by a slow-moving reptile dropped from the clouds. 2. This might be the most aggressive way to win a lawsuit in human history. Clement Vallandigham was a 19th-century lawyer defending a man accused of murder in a bar fight. His legal strategy was to prove the victim was clumsy and shot himself. To demonstrate this, Clement stood before a hotel room full of peers, grabbed a gun he thought was empty, and pulled the trigger into his own gut. The gun was definitely loaded, and he died the next day. The jury was so impressed by his commitment that they acquitted his client. He literally won the case by cross-examining himself into the afterlife. 3. King Louis III of France was a young, energetic monarch who literally died from being too thirsty for romance. In the year 882, the king was riding his horse through the streets when he spotted a beautiful young woman. He decided to chase after her, presumably to use a terrible royal pickup line. The terrified girl ran into her father's house for safety. Louis, caught up in the heat of the moment, tried to ride his horse straight through the door after her. He misjudged the height of the doorway, slammed his head violently against the wooden lintel, and fractured his skull. He died shortly after, proving that chasing women on horseback is a safety hazard. He is the only king in history to be defeated by a doorframe and his own hormones. 4. Having a great beard is cool until it decides to betray you in a burning building. Hans Steininger was a mayor in 16th century Austria who was famous for a 4-foot-long beard that he usually kept rolled up in a pouch. When a fire broke out one night, he panicked and forgot to pack up his facial hair. He started running, stepped on his own chin curtain, tumbled down the stairs, and snapped his neck. He essentially tripped over his own face. It is the only recorded instance where a man survived a fire but was assassinated by his own grooming choices. 5. King Adolf Frederick of Sweden ate a meal that would have killed a hippo. In 1771, he sat down for a feast of lobster, caviar, and champagne, which is already a recipe for a heavy nap. But he decided to go for the high score by eating 14 bowls of semla, which are heavy buns soaked in warm milk. His stomach immediately filed for divorce, and he died of severe digestive failure that night. He is not remembered for his politics or wars, but forever known as the king who literally ate himself to death with pastry. 6. The Duke of Clarence, George Plantagenet, found a way to turn an execution into happy hour. In 1478, he was sentenced to death for plotting against his brother, the King of England. Being of royal blood, he was allowed to choose his method of execution. Instead of the axe or the rope, George asked to be drowned in a massive barrel of his favorite Malmsey wine. His wish was granted. He was shoved headfirst into the vat of alcohol and drowned in the drink he loved most. It is the ultimate example of having one too many. He didn't just drink the bar dry, he literally became part of the drink menu. 7. Franz Reichelt was a tailor who was absolutely convinced he could defy gravity with a suit made of fabric scraps. In 1912, he told the press he had invented a parachute suit that would allow aviators to survive falls. To prove it, he climbed to the top of the Eiffel Tower. The police thought he was going to use a dummy, but Franz stood on the ledge and declared that he was the test subject. Footage of this actually exists, and you can see him hesitating for a long time, realizing that maybe gravity is real. But his ego was too big to back down. He jumped, the suit did absolutely nothing, and he hit the frozen ground instantly, creating a literal crater. He wanted to be remembered as the Wright brothers, but he is remembered as the guy who proved that sewing skills do not make you a bird. 8. Tycho Brahe was a genius astronomer who could map the stars, but he could not figure out how to excuse himself for a bathroom break. During a banquet in Prague in 1601, he realized he had to go, but court rules said nobody leaves the table before the king. Being a polite guest, he sat there for hours in agony, holding a gallon of wine in his system. His bladder eventually gave up the fight and burst, leading to a fatal infection. He discovered the laws of planetary motion, but he died because he was too awkward to ask where the toilet was. 9. The first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, was so obsessed with living forever that he accidentally killed himself trying to achieve it. He was absolutely terrified of death, so he hired a team of elite alchemists to brew a magic potion that would make him immortal. Their brilliant medical advice was to feed the emperor pills made of pure mercury. Yes, the toxic liquid metal that drives people insane. He thought consuming this shiny poison would harden his body and make him eternal, but instead, it just slowly destroyed his brain and shut down his organs. He died while on a tour of his empire, likely hallucinating from heavy metal poisoning. To make it even more ridiculous, his advisors were so afraid of people finding out he was dead that they hid his body in a carriage full of rotting fish to mask the smell. 10. Heraclitus was an ancient Greek philosopher who hated people, and his own wellness routine ended up killing him. He suffered from dropsy, which caused swelling in his body. Being a know-it-all who didn't trust doctors, he decided the cure was to evaporate the water out of his system. His brilliant plan was to bury himself up to his neck in cow manure, thinking the heat from the dung would draw out the sickness. Instead, the manure trapped him there, and depending on which historian you believe, he either baked to death in the sun or was eaten by a pack of wild dogs because he couldn't move. He literally died because he thought covering himself in poop was a valid medical procedure. 11. Being popular is usually a great ego boost, but for the ancient Athenian lawmaker Draco, having too many fans was actually a fatal condition. In the 7th century BC, the traditional Greek way to show approval for a public figure was to throw your hats, cloaks, and tunics onto them, sort of like a heavy wool version of throwing roses on stage. Draco gave such an incredible speech at the Aegina Theater that the audience went completely feral with excitement. They launched so many heavy garments at him that he was buried underneath a literal mountain of sweaty laundry. By the time his supporters dug him out to celebrate, he had suffocated to death under the weight of their appreciation. He is the guy who wrote the harshest laws in Athens, yet he was taken out by a pile of shirts because his fan club didn't know when to stop clapping with their clothes. 12. Karma has a really weird way of working, and for the Viking leader Sigurd the Mighty, it came in the form of incredibly bad dental hygiene. After winning a battle against a rival leader, Sigurd decided to take a very strange trophy home with him. He strapped the defeated leader's helmet and head to his saddle like a bizarre hood ornament. As he was riding home, bouncing up and down, a giant buck tooth from the trophy kept bumping into Sigurd's leg. Eventually, that tooth grazed his skin just enough to cause a scratch. Because Vikings didn't have hand sanitizer or antibiotics, that tiny little scratch turned into a massive infection. Sigurd ended up passing away days later, meaning he was technically defeated by a guy who wasn't even in the fight anymore. 13. Chrysippus was a Greek philosopher who specialized in Stoicism, which is ironic because he completely lost his cool and died from laughing too hard at his own bad joke. One afternoon, he saw a donkey eating some of his figs. Instead of shooing the animal away, he decided this was the funniest thing he had ever seen in his life. He turned to his servant and shouted the punchline, telling him to give the donkey some wine to wash down the figs. He found this comment so hysterically funny that he fell to the ground, gasping for air, and literally laughed until he suffered a seizure and died. It is arguably the most embarrassing way for a serious intellectual to go. He spent his life teaching people how to control their emotions, only to be taken out by a fig-eating donkey. 14. King Alexander of Greece died because his dog got into a street fight with a monkey, which sounds like a fever dream but is actual history. In 1920, the king was walking his German shepherd, Fritz, in the royal gardens when a domestic macaque monkey attacked the dog. Alexander jumped in to break up the brawl like a responsible pet owner, but a second monkey joined the fight and bit the king on the leg and torso. He didn't think much of it at the time because he was a king and had bigger problems, but the wounds became severely infected. Sepsis set in quickly, and the ruler of Greece was defeated by a bacterial infection from an angry primate. Winston Churchill later famously noted that 250,000 people died in the resulting political chaos, all because of a monkey bite. 15. Sir Francis Bacon is known as the father of the scientific method, but he died doing an experiment that looks like a late-night drunk idea. In 1626, he was riding in his carriage through the snow when he suddenly wondered if ice could be used to preserve meat. He was so excited by this thought that he stopped the carriage, bought a chicken from a poor woman, and spent an hour standing in the freezing cold stuffing snow inside the bird to see if it would stay fresh. The experiment was technically a success because the chicken froze, but Bacon caught a massive chill that turned into pneumonia. He died shortly after, essentially sacrificing his life for the invention of frozen nuggets. 16. Harry Houdini was the greatest escape artist who ever lived, a man who could break out of handcuffs, straitjackets, and water tanks. But he couldn't escape a surprise vibe check from a college student. In 1926, Houdini was relaxing in his dressing room when a student asked if it was true that the magician could withstand any punch to the stomach. Before Houdini could tighten his abs or even say yes, the enthusiastic fan delivered several hard punches to his gut. Houdini played it cool, but the punches ruptured his appendix. Being a stubborn showman, he refused to cancel his performance and performed in agony before finally going to the hospital where it was too late. The man spent his life cheating death in the most dangerous stunts imaginable, only to be taken out by a cheap shot in a dressing room. 17. Poets are known for being dramatic, but the famous Chinese poet Li Bai took his love for nature way too far during a drunken boat ride. Li Bai was known for two things: writing beautiful verses and drinking enough wine to float a battleship. One night, he was out on the Yangtze River, completely intoxicated, when he saw the reflection of the moon in the calm water. In his drunken logic, he decided the moon looked lonely and needed a hug. He leaned over the side of the boat to embrace the celestial reflection, lost his balance, and fell straight into the river. He was too drunk to swim and drowned trying to cuddle a beam of light. He left behind a legacy of brilliant literature, but his final act was proving that alcohol and deep water are a terrible combination for stargazing. 18. King Bela of Hungary had a very short and shaky reign that ended in one of the most ridiculous furniture accidents in history. In 1063, he was sitting on his massive wooden throne, likely judging people or making laws, when the entire structure just gave up on life. The throne collapsed under him with such force that it caused fatal internal injuries. It was widely rumored that his political enemies had rigged the chair to fail, but regardless of the plot, the result is the same. He was a medieval ruler who survived wars and political intrigue only to be taken out by faulty carpentry work in his own living room. It gives a whole new reason to check the screws on your chair before you sit down. 19. General John Sedgwick holds the undisputed championship title for the worst timing in the history of warfare. During the American Civil War Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, his troops were ducking for cover because Confederate snipers were firing at them from about 1,000 yards away. Sedgwick was fearless and annoyed by his soldiers flinching, so he stood up tall and started mocking them for being scared. He shouted his famous last words, claiming that the enemy couldn't hit an elephant at this distance. Less than a second after finishing that sentence, a sniper bullet struck him right below the eye, killing him instantly. He was a high-ranking general who died because he was too busy roasting his own men to realize that bullets actually travel very far. Irony has never hit anyone harder or faster than it hit John Sedgwick. 20. Sherwood Anderson was a famous American writer who survived the Spanish flu and the grind of the literary world, but he could not survive a cocktail party. In 1941, he was on a cruise to South America and enjoying a fancy martini that came with an olive on a toothpick. He was having such a great time talking and drinking that he didn't notice he had accidentally swallowed the little wooden toothpick along with the olive. That tiny piece of wood decided to go on a journey through his intestines and punctured his internal organs. He fell ill and died of peritonitis a few days later. It is honestly the most bourgeoisie way to go. You expect a writer to die from a broken heart or too much whiskey, not because he failed to separate the appetizer from the cutlery during a toast. 21. Isadora Duncan was a superstar dancer in the 1920s who loved drama and high fashion, but her wardrobe choice eventually turned against her in a freak accident. She was going for a ride in a convertible sports car in France and decided to wear her signature long flowing silk scarf. As she yelled goodbye to her friends and the car sped off, the long scarf caught in the spokes of the rear wheel. In a split second, the scarf tightened and pulled her out of the seat. It wasn't a crash or a collision, it was just a piece of clothing deciding that the ride was over. She was famously quoted as saying she was off to glory right before getting in the car. It serves as a grim but important reminder that when you are in a convertible, maybe leave the 6-foot-long accessories at home. 22. Kurt Gödel was one of the smartest logicians and mathematicians to ever walk the earth, basically the Einstein of logic. But his brain was his own worst enemy. He developed an intense, irrational fear that people were trying to poison his food. He trusted absolutely no one except his wife, Adele, and refused to eat anything unless she cooked it and tasted it first. This system worked fine until Adele had to go to the hospital for a minor surgery and stayed there for 6 months. Instead of ordering a pizza or cooking for himself, Kurt simply followed his own logic to the extreme and refused to eat anything at all. He eventually starved to death because his wife wasn't there to be his food taster. He was a genius who could solve impossible math problems, but he couldn't figure out how to make a sandwich without panicking. 23. Henry Hall was a 94-year-old lighthouse keeper in England in 1755, and he had a stomach made of steel. When the roof of his lighthouse caught fire, he looked up to see what was happening. At that exact moment, the lead sheeting on the roof melted and poured down like liquid rain. A massive glob of molten lead fell straight into his open mouth and went down his throat. Amazingly, he didn't die immediately. He walked to a doctor's house and complained that he had swallowed lead, but the doctor thought he was just a crazy old man. Henry died 12 days later, and during the autopsy, the doctor found a solid 7-ounce lump of lead in his stomach. He is the only man in history to accidentally turn his own stomach into a metal foundry and survive for nearly 2 weeks. 24. Thomas Migley Jr. was an inventor who accidentally harmed the planet with leaded gas, but his final invention decided to target him personally. After contracting polio, he lost the use of his legs, but his ego was still fully functional. He refused to let nurses help him move, so he designed a complex system of ropes, pulleys, and bars to lift himself out of bed like a human puppet. It was a brilliant engineering marvel until one morning when the machine malfunctioned. The ropes got twisted around his neck, and the contraption strangled him in his own bedroom. He spent his life inventing things that were dangerous for the environment, and in the end, he built the only machine in history that woke up and chose violence against its creator. It is the ultimate example of a DIY project gone horribly wrong. 25. Bobby Leach was a fearless daredevil who laughed in the face of danger, but he should have been more afraid of fruit. In 1911, he became the second person ever to go over Niagara Falls in a steel barrel and survive, breaking several bones but proving he was tough as nails. He traveled the world bragging about his death-defying stunt, feeling invincible. Then, while walking down a quiet street in New Zealand, he stepped on a literal orange peel. Yes, like a scene from a bad cartoon. He slipped, fell hard, and broke his leg. The injury got infected, and he died from complications shortly after. The man survived a 170-foot drop down a raging waterfall inside a metal drum, only to be taken out by the skin of a breakfast fruit on a sidewalk. Gravity really waited for the most embarrassing moment to catch up with him. 26. Conducting an orchestra is usually safe, but Jean-Baptiste Lully turned music into an extreme sport. In the 17th century, conductors did not use those tiny little wands we see today. They used a massive heavy staff that they banged on the floor to keep the beat. Lully was conducting a celebration for the King of France and was getting way too into the music. He was smashing the staff down with so much passion and energy that he missed the floor and crushed his own toe. He refused to stop working or see a doctor because the show must go on. The toe developed a nasty infection that spread to his leg and eventually killed him. He is the only musician in history to literally rock out so hard that he died from a self-inflicted percussion injury. It gives a whole new meaning to putting your heart and soul and foot into your art. 27. Sunanda Kumariratana was a 19th century queen of Thailand who found herself in a situation that was equal parts tragic and incredibly stupid due to royal protocol. She was on a boat trip when the vessel capsized, throwing her into the water. She was surrounded by guards, servants, and onlookers who could have easily pulled her out. However, there was an ancient law that stated touching the queen was a crime punishable by death. So, the guards just stood there and watched her struggle because they were more afraid of the law than of letting their boss drown. They literally followed the employee handbook to the letter, while the queen sank right in front of them. It is the most extreme case of workplace bureaucracy ever recorded. She died not because she couldn't be saved, but because nobody wanted to get fired for unauthorized touching. 28. We all know vegetables are good for you, but Basil Brown was a British health enthusiast who took that advice to a fatal extreme in 1974. He was absolutely obsessed with staying healthy and decided that carrot juice was the elixir of life. He didn't just drink a glass a day, he drank over a gallon of the stuff every single day, ignoring doctors who told him to chill out. He consumed so much vitamin A that his skin actually turned bright yellow, making him look like a human highlighter. Eventually, his liver completely shut down from the toxic overload of vitamins, and he died. He managed to do the impossible by overdosing on health food. It is a cautionary tale that even if you are trying to be the healthiest person alive, there is such a thing as too much of a good thing, especially when you start changing colors. 29. Jack Daniel is a name synonymous with good whiskey and bad decisions, but his death was the ultimate result of a temper tantrum. One early morning in 1911, the famous distiller tried to open his office safe to get some paperwork. The problem was that he had a terrible memory and completely forgot the combination. Instead of taking a deep breath or calling a locksmith like a normal person, he got frustrated and kicked the heavy metal safe as hard as he could. He broke his toe, which seemed minor at the time, but the injury soon became infected. The infection spread up his leg, eventually leading to amputation and his death. He built an empire of alcohol that has ruined millions of livers, but he was taken out because he tried to fight a piece of steel furniture and lost. It is a lesson to us all that if you forget your password, just wait a minute before you start doing karate on your office equipment. 30. Frank Hayes holds the record for the most impressive athletic achievement by a dead guy. In 1923, he was a jockey riding a horse named Sweet Kiss in a steeplechase race at Belmont Park. Somewhere in the middle of the race, Frank suffered a massive heart attack and died instantly in the saddle. However, his body somehow stayed balanced on the horse, likely due to rigor mortis or just pure luck. The horse, Sweet Kiss, had no idea her rider had checked out, so she kept running and actually won the race. Frank Hayes crossed the finish line as a corpse, making him the only jockey in history to win a race after he had technically expired. The horse was later nicknamed Sweet Kiss of Death because nothing says victory like carrying a dead man around the track for a photo finish. 31. Empedocles was an ancient Greek philosopher who had an ego big enough to fill a stadium, and he genuinely believed he was a god living among mortals. To prove to his followers that he was immortal and supernatural, he came up with a genius plan to jump into the active volcano of Mount Etna. He figured that if he disappeared into the fire and didn't leave a body, people would think he had ascended to the heavens. So he dramatically leaped into the crater. Obviously, he was incinerated instantly because he was made of meat and not magic. However, the volcano had the last laugh. A few hours later, the volcano burped and spat out one of his bronze sandals, which landed near the edge for his followers to find. The mountain literally rejected his footwear, proving that not only was he not a god, but he also left behind undeniable proof of his own stupidity. 32. King George II of Great Britain died in a way that creates an uncomfortable amount of anxiety for anyone over 50. In 1760, the king woke up, had his usual cup of hot chocolate, and went into his private water closet to do his morning business. A few minutes later, his valet heard a loud crash. He ran in and found the king dead on the floor. It turns out the monarch had exerted himself a little too hard while sitting on the toilet, causing an aortic dissection, which is basically his heart exploding from the pressure. He died on the throne, but not the shiny golden one in the main hall. It is a hilarious but tragic reminder that even the most powerful men in the world, who command armies and rule empires, are still vulnerable to the most basic bodily functions. He lived like a king, but went out like Elvis before Elvis even existed. 33. Frederick Barbarossa was the Holy Roman Emperor and a legendary warrior who led massive armies, but he was defeated by basic swimming physics. During the Third Crusade in the 12th century, he was marching his army across what is now Turkey. It was a hot day, and the emperor wanted to cool off or cross the Salef River quickly. Despite his advisors probably screaming no, he decided to ride his horse into the water or jump in for a swim. The problem was that he was wearing full medieval plate mail armor, which weighs an absolute ton. Unsurprisingly, metal does not float. The emperor sank like a stone to the bottom of the shallow river and drowned in waist-deep water while his massive army watched in confusion. His death caused such chaos that most of his troops just gave up and went home. He prepared for battle against great empires but lost his life to a small river because he forgot to take off his metal suit. 34. James Otis Jr. was an American revolutionary who fought for independence, but his connection to the weather was frankly supernatural. He had often told his friends and family that when his time came, he hoped to be struck by lightning. It sounded like poetic nonsense or just a dramatic thing to say at parties. But in 1783, he was standing in the doorway of a friend's house watching a thunderstorm, probably admiring the view. Suddenly, a single bolt of lightning came down from the heavens, bypassed all the trees and chimneys, and struck him directly. He died instantly, exactly as he had predicted. It is one of the only times in history where someone placed a specific order with the universe for their own death, and the universe actually delivered the package right to their doorstep with express shipping. 35. Ingestion of Phrygia is the only athlete in Olympic history to win a gold medal while being completely dead. In the ancient Greek games of 564 BC, he was competing in pankration, which was basically MMA with zero rules. His opponent had him in a chokehold that was slowly squeezing the life out of him. With his last ounce of strength, Ingestion kicked his opponent's ankle so hard that it dislocated. The pain was so intense that the opponent tapped out and surrendered. However, at that exact same second, Ingestion's neck broke from the chokehold. The referees declared him the winner because the other guy quit first. They placed the olive wreath on his corpse and paraded him around as the champion. He literally fought until his last breath and proved that you don't actually need a pulse to be number one. 36. Gouverneur Morris was a founding father of the United States who helped write the Constitution, but he should have left the medical procedures to the professionals. In 1816, he was suffering from a blockage in his urinary tract, which is obviously painful. But instead of seeing a doctor, he decided to go purely DIY. He grabbed a piece of whalebone from his wife's corset and tried to use it as a homemade catheter to clear the blockage himself. Unsurprisingly, shoving a piece of a whale into your own internal organs is a terrible idea. He caused massive internal damage and a severe infection, leading to his death. He was a brilliant man who helped build a nation, but he died because he thought he could fix his own body with a piece of women's fashion and zero medical training. 37. William Henry Harrison holds the record for the shortest presidency in American history because he had too much pride to wear a coat. On his inauguration day in 1841, the weather was freezing, wet, and miserable. But Harrison, who was 68 years old, wanted to prove he was still a tough military man. He refused to wear a hat or a coat and proceeded to deliver the longest inauguration speech in history, talking for nearly 2 hours in the freezing rain. He basically bored the crowd to tears while turning himself into a human popsicle. He caught a nasty cold that turned into pneumonia, and he died just 31 days later. He worked his entire life to become the most powerful man in America, only to lose it all because he was too stubborn to put on a jacket and shut up a little earlier. 38. The Collier brothers were the undisputed kings of hoarding long before reality TV shows existed. Homer and Langley Collier lived in a New York mansion filled from floor to ceiling with junk, including 14 pianos and a Model T Ford chassis. They were paranoid about burglars, so Langley built intricate booby traps all over the house to protect their trash. In 1947, Langley was crawling through a tunnel of newspapers to bring food to his blind brother Homer when he accidentally tripped one of his own traps. A massive pile of heavy junk collapsed on him, crushing him to death. Homer, who was blind and paralyzed, starved to death days later just a few feet away because his brother never came back with dinner. They spent their lives guarding their garbage, only to be literally buried by it in the end. 39. Alexander Bogdanov was a Russian physician and science fiction writer who was obsessed with the idea of eternal youth. He believed that blood transfusions were the key to immortality, and that swapping blood with young people would keep him alive forever. He actually performed these experiments on himself multiple times and claimed he felt younger and more energetic. But in 1928, he decided to trade blood with a student who was suffering from malaria and tuberculosis. Bogdanov's genius theory was that his healthy blood would cure the student and the student's young blood would boost him. Instead, the diseases and incompatible blood types caused a massive reaction, and Bogdanov died quickly. He was searching for the fountain of youth, but essentially injected himself with a lethal cocktail of rejection and disease. 40. Pyrrhus of Epirus was one of the greatest generals of antiquity, a man who terrified Rome, but his career ended because of an angry grandmother. In 272 BC, he was fighting a street battle in the city of Argos. It was chaotic, with soldiers and horses everywhere. An old woman was watching the fight from her rooftop and saw Pyrrhus fighting her son in the street below. Not wanting her boy to get hurt, she grabbed a heavy roof tile and threw it down with incredible aim. The tile hit Pyrrhus right on the neck, paralyzing him and knocking him off his horse, where he was easily finished off. He survived battles against the greatest armies in the world, only to be taken out by an elderly lady doing some tactical gardening from her balcony. It proves that you should never mess with someone's kid when mom is watching. 41. Attila the Hun was the scourge of God, a warrior who conquered half of Europe and made emperors tremble, but he couldn't survive his own wedding party. In 453, he married a young woman named Ildiko and threw a massive celebration. Attila spent the night eating huge amounts of food and drinking until he could barely see straight. He passed out in a drunken stupor, which seems normal for a warlord. However, during his sleep, he suffered a severe nosebleed. Because he was so intoxicated and lying flat on his back, he didn't wake up or cough. He simply drowned in his own blood without ever waking up. The man who survived thousands of swords and arrows was ultimately defeated by a mix of alcohol and gravity. His army found him the next morning, dead without a single wound on his body. 42. The French playwright Molière died in a moment of irony so perfect it sounds scripted. In 1673, he was starring in his own play called The Imaginary Invalid, where he played a hypochondriac who falsely claims to be sick to get attention. During the fourth performance, Molière, who was actually suffering from real tuberculosis, started coughing up blood violently on stage. The audience thought his coughing fit was just incredible method acting and applauded his performance. He managed to finish the play but collapsed immediately after the curtain fell and died a few hours later. He spent his final moments pretending to be sick while actually dying, receiving a standing ovation for suffering in real time. It is the ultimate show must go on moment in theater history. 43. Pope Adrian IV is the only Englishman to ever become pope, but his reign was cut short by a tiny insect with a bad attitude. In 1159, the Pope was taking a refreshing sip of wine on a hot day. he didn't notice that a fly had landed in his goblet. As he took a drink, he inhaled the fly, which got lodged in his throat. He started choking violently. His doctors and servants tried to help, but back then, the Heimlich maneuver did not exist. The leader of the Catholic Church, God's representative on earth, choked to death on a common housefly. It is arguably the most anticlimactic death of a religious figure in history. He survived political schemes and wars, only to be defeated by a bug that probably didn't even know it was assassinating the Pope. 44. Felix IV was the president of France in 1899, and he decided to go out with a bang, quite literally. He was in his private office with his mistress, Marguerite Steinheil, engaging in some very unofficial presidential business. Suddenly, he suffered a massive stroke during the act. When the staff rushed in after hearing screams, they found the president dead, still clutching the poor woman's hair in a death grip so tight they had to cut it to free her. It was a massive scandal at the time, but the French public eventually found the humor in it. He is remembered as the president who wanted to finish his term but ended up finishing something else entirely. It remains the most famous case of death by pleasure in political history. Here's the scary part. History is full of deaths so dumb and random they feel unfinished. Which one should have been in this list but wasn't? Don't be polite. Drop the most absurd death you know in the comments and prove history is even worse than this video. Like it if reality annoyed you. Subscribe if you want more proof that fate has zero respect for humans.